At some point, I'm going to have to interrupt and do a little chumash. Officially, this is a chumash class and a siddur class, although this is whatever I want to do class, as you know by now. But we have 4 weeks. We're going to start. We're going to dabble about it. We're going to taste Baruch Sheamar. And Mitzvah Hashem next year, I hope to teach Baruch Sheamar properly, comprehensively. There's so much of Baruch Sheamar, we have no idea. I mean, just to collect the material of Baruch Sheamar could be a shelf. There's so much on Baruch Sheamar. It's impossible to collect it all. Simply physically impossible to collect it all. But we're going to do our best. My plan is to introduce Baruch Sheamar, to give you background, and then to translate it. And I'm going to focus only on the Rishonim and on Chassidus. In other words, to do everybody is so much. It's impossible. So, here we go. We're doing Baruch Sheamar. Okay, so the first thing is, Baruch Sheamar is the bracha that we say before Sukkot Zimra. You know by now that tefillah is a ladder with 4 rungs. Davening in the morning is a ladder with 4 rungs. The Zohar says, Sulamutz of Adsev Rosh Yaakov Avinu has a dream. And in his dream he sees a ladder. He's underneath the ladder, and Hashem is sitting on top of the ladder. And he's acting as what's called a merkava. He's a chariot. Yaakov Avinu is a chariot. Hashem is sitting upon him, and the links, the steps in between Yaakov Avinu is laying on the ground, and the Eibishter who's sitting at the top of the ladder, on top of Yaakov Avinu, is a ladder of 4 rungs. So the Zohar says, Sulam dat sloisa. This ladder is the ladder which is associated with prayer. You should know that Rambam, in his introduction to the Moreh Nevuchim, talks about prophecies. And he says, when Nevi'im say prophecy, they describe a gestalt, they describe an image, they describe a form. Sometimes every single detail of that form is precise. And sometimes the details don't matter, just the basic point. So he wants to give one example where every single detail matters. He gives the example of Yaakov's dream. That in Yaakov's dream, every detail of the ladder is negay, is precise. That's what the Rambam writes. Anyway, so Yaakov Avinu is connected to Eibishter through a ladder. That ladder, the Zohar says, Sulam dat sloisa. This ladder is the ladder of prayer. The first rung is Asiyah. We finished Asiyah. Asiyah is Til Baruch Sheamar. It's Mekdani, it's Hadeni Makabal, it's Matevu, it's Hadeni Lom, it's Vayiyachar, it's Hadeni Yodam, it's Karbonas. And of course, according to us, it's also Haidu, right? Ashkenazim, Misnagdim, if any of you have ever davened other Neschos, and you've been around people who daven different Neschos, which is a good thing, by the way. It's very, very good to see different customs. You don't have to get confused by them, but it's nice to see the variety within Torah customs. Ashkenazim say Haidu after Baruch Sheamar. We say Haidu before Baruch Sheamar. All of this is called Asiyah. It's a stage of davening where we're accepting Hashem. We say to the Eibishter, you're here and you're real. I don't have to understand. Baruch Sheamar is the beginning of Sukkot Zimra. Now, earlier this year, I think, if not this year, last year, I gave you a series of classes that introduced Baruch Sukkot Zimra. We did L'Shem Yichud. L'Shem Yichud we did recently enough for you to remember. Remember we did L'Shem Yichud a bunch of weeks? Before that we did another, it was last year. I gave an introduction to Sukkot Zimra. If you go online, you go to the new website, Baruch Hashem, which is driving everybody nuts. We made the website all from scratch, from the beginning, all over again. Because we want to make a better app, and that's the only way to do it. So that's what we did, and we're having all kinds of trouble, but Mitzvah Hashem and decided to all clear up. And people are complaining all day and all night. The 1 step backward for the 2 steps forward, Mitzvah Hashem. But if you go to my website, you go to my siddur section, I have a long introduction on Sukkot Zimra. I explain what Sukkot Zimra is, I go through the different opinions and the definitions, it's a whole story. Sukkot Zimra is considered the second rung of the davening. And Sukkot Zimra is flanked by brachas. Baruch Sheamar in the beginning and Yishtabach in the end. The third rung of the ladder, which is the world of Bria, is Shema, which is also flanked by brachas. Right? You say Shema in the morning and you say Shema at night. And the Pasuk says, and the Chazal brings it, the Halacha brings it, Sheva Bayoy Milalticha. That there are 7 brachas that we say along with Shema. How do you have 7 brachas along with Shema? In the morning you say 2 before and 1 after. Yetzer Erev Cheshech till Yetzer HaMeir is the first bracha. Avas Olam until Becha V'Amishal is the second bracha. And then after Shema we have one bracha, Emes V'Yatziv, right? Emes is not a part of Krishma. Emes is a part of the bracha, Emes V'Yatziv V'Nocha V'Kav Yasha until Go Yisrael. At night we have four. Two before Asher V'Dvarim Manav Aravim until Baruch Hashem Manav Aravim. Then Avas Olam, as we do it, right? We say Avas Olam in the morning and at night, right? And then you say Oyev Abba Yisrael, and then afterward you say Emes Ve'emuna. In the morning you say Emes Ve'Yatziv. At night you say Emes Ve'emuna until Gal Yisrael, and then you add a bracha Hashkivim. So Psukkah de Zimra is flanked by brachas, and Shema is flanked by brachas. The difference is that in Psukkah de Zimra the brachas are small and the flank and the middle is big. By Krishma the brachas are bigger than the Krishma itself, and that's Elam Abriya. And then Shemaina Esrei, this is Elam Atzilus. It's a ladder. And if you look at the Kisvei Arizal, the writings Arizal, or Mishal Chassidim, on the Sfarim, you'll see how after Shemaina Esrei you're actually climbing down. Like Kavolotzi and his Bria and Shoshayev with Yitzira and Kavi is here. You're actually climbing back down. You go up to the top of the mountain. Shemona Esrei is more or less the peak, and then you climb back down. That's the Seder of Tefillah. Sulam, it's Sulam, that's this. So we're starting the second rung. We're starting Sukkot de Zimra, which I introduced, as I recall, last year. Okay, with Baruch Sheamar. Baruch Sheamar is the bracha that opens Sukkot de Zimra. So we're going to be talking about Psukkah de Baruch Sheamar. We're going to be translating Psukkah de Baruch Sheamar. We're going to have a lot of conversations. A few things to say about Baruch Sheamar. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, like, how can people put Hodu before or after Baruch Sheamar if it's part of like this first rung of the ladder?
Because that's what the debate is. The argument is in Kabbalah itself. The argument is in Kabbalah itself. In other words, the Misnagdim were big Mukubbalah. They're a different Kabbalah that we have. And in their Kabbalah, Hodu belongs after Psukkah de Zimra. You see, this is a conversation which I'm not qualified to have for many, many reasons, including that I don't think I have enough of an open mind. You have to really, if you want to ask, you have to really defend both positions. And I don't know enough about, I don't know enough about anything, but I certainly know enough about the sheet of the Ashkenazim. You need to understand the history. The history is that Kabbalah came after Halacha. So Kabbalah came after the Siddur. The Siddur is 2,500 years old. The Siddur was written before the second Beis HaMikdash was put up, not destroyed. Siddur is way older than the Mishnah and the Gemara. Yes? Now, the people who wrote that Siddur were very, very big Kabbalists, but they didn't give their reasons. They just wrote a text. Over time, that Siddur evolved, and let's say for the sake of argument, 800 years ago, 700 years ago, 600, Kabbalah makes this huge appearance and a very big radiation. So what happens is Kabbalah comes along after, and is explaining things that came before. Kabbalah is explaining all the 613 mitzvahs, which we have for 3,000 years. Kabbalah is explaining the Nusach HaTfilah, which we have 2,000 years, and so on. Yeah? Now what happens when Kabbalah comes along and says, you've been doing it wrong this whole time. You should really do it like this. And it begins with the Zohar. The Zohar was written at the same time as the Mishnah, but we didn't find it till 700 years ago. So the Zohar may be a very ancient book, but for 1,000 years, people did things a certain way. Then along comes the Zohar, and it says, no, we've done it wrong all along. So the Zohar is an ancient text. So you have a real problem, because the Zohar is as old as the Mishnah. You see? So part of what happens in that scenario is that there's a machlekes. When Kabbalah and Halacha argue, what do you do? And the answer to that question is, it depends who you ask. Sfardim are going to say that when Kabbalah and Halacha argue, you follow Kabbalah. And Ashkenazim are going to say when Kabbalah and Halacha argue, you follow Halacha. So that's part of the reason they would put Hodu after Baruch Sheamar, because halachically it belongs there. In Gemara, but it's not even in Gemara, but in Shulchan Aruch. In the early Achreinim, when Hodu becomes a part of our prayer, it was placed after Baruch Sheamar. You go look Siddurim before the Kabbalistic radiation by Ashkenaz. I don't know about Sfad. Hodu was after Baruch Sheamar. Then along comes Kabbalah and says, no, put it before. So the Misnagdim are saying, I'm sorry, we don't change our tradition because of Kabbalah. We study Kabbalah, we understand what Kabbalah contributes, but the Minhagim don't change. Now, there is certainly a Kabbalah to the Halacha. In other words, it's not that you're doing things in Halacha that are against Kabbalah. You're doing the Halacha which are following a different Kabbalah, you understand? And we have our Kabbalah. So that's the answer to your question. It doesn't help you, it doesn't explain the two ways of looking at Haidah. Let me give you something to consider, okay? The word Haidah means to submit, yes? That sounds like I'm looking before Baruch Sheamar. It's an act of submission, right? What does Mizmor L'Shoida mean? A song of submission that we all hold as after Baruch Sheamar. Now, why is that Haidah after Baruch Sheamar and this Haidah before Baruch Sheamar? You see what I'm saying? It's dynamic. It's complicated. Every position in Torah can be defended because every position in Torah is sourced in Gedolei Yisrael. The Siddur especially was not for the faint of heart. Contributors to the Siddur were the greatest of the great, always. Always. Siddur is very, very, very sensitive because it's all mysticism. Now, there are certain binding constants in Siddur which are more down to earth, and one of them, of course, is grammar, diktuk. And there are people who are very, very caught up in grammar. There are people who hold that the only thing that matters in davening is to daven with correct grammar, and they'll take things out of the Siddur which are very important Kabbalistically because they're non-grammatical. And then they'll say, no, sorry, grammar ahin, grammar ahead, that's how it's supposed to be. Even Ashkenazim. Even non-Hasidim, in other words, people who put halacha before Kabbalah, they don't always do things according to Kabbalah, to diktuk, pardon me, which is a big problem because halacha is supposed to daven the correct grammar. And of course, the biggest problem of all is there's big arguments about what's correct diktuk. There's so many different opinions in the Daikonim. The Hebrew grammar is complicated. There's different opinions about Hebrew grammar, and that comes to play in davening as well. Anyway, that's a long way to answer a short question. There's a few things that I want to say before we start. Okay, the first thing is, did the Anshe Knesset Haggadah write Baruch Sheamar Yishtabach, yes or no? Is Baruch Sheamar Yishtabach as old as Shemini Esrei or not? Some people say it's younger. Some people say it was written by the same people, but it was written later. Meaning, even if you hold that Anshe Knesset Haggadah wrote it, they didn't write it when they wrote the original Siddur, which is the Shemini Esrei, they wrote it afterwards. Okay? And then there's a big number two. The big number two is fantastic. It says in Helikas Svarim, I don't know how far back this goes, but it goes back a long time, that the prayer Baruch Sheamar we have because a note was dropped from heaven. Piskim Mishmei Shmaya Nachs. A note came out of the heaven, and Baruch Sheamar was written on this note, and that's how we have the prayer Baruch Sheamar. Now, of course, you have to scratch your head and say, so what? Was it white paper or was it pink paper, right? Is that a man or a woman? And what handwriting was it written in? And what nusach was on that piece of paper? And you can ask a whole bunch of other questions about that very statement. And by the way, that's not the only instance where we use that expression. I've seen other instances where you'll find in Svarim and in Chazal that expression, that this we know because a note came from Piskim Mishmei Shmaya Nachs. Now, it's possible that it literally happened. The paper came out of heaven. I certainly believe it could be. But there are ways of explaining it that are more dynamic, that are more complicated, okay? But there's one other thing which is in Baruch Sheamar. Baruch Sheamar is a bracha with a prefix, as is Yishtabach, okay? Now, if you're looking at your first page, this is our already. If you look at the first page, yeah? So I numbered it 1 through 17, you see? And I numbered it both on the Hebrew side and on the English side, so that you know how to find each Hebrew line of the English translation. You see what I'm showing you? The first two Hebrew lines begin on the first line, the second two will begin on the second line, and the English is obviously longer than the Hebrew, it's always going to be, so it's more stretched out. But on both sides you have 17 lines. The bracha begins by number 10. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech is the bracha, which means that the first 9 items are a pre-bracha. Baruch Sheamar starts with Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech. Now, if you happen to have a siddur handy, which I don't, Yishabach is the same thing. Yishabach is the end of Psukei de Zimra, right? What page is Yishabach on? Oh, page 41, yeah? So where does the bracha start? On page 42 at the top, Baruch atah Hashem. More than half of Yishtabach, like more than half of Baruch Sheamar, is a prefix. Yishtabach Shimcha Adma Akev, it's not a bracha yet. Okay, HaGodol, HaMelech, HaGodol, HaKodesh, right? The bracha is on top of the next page. Baruch atah Hashem, Kel Melech HaBrachos. Now you should know this matters in halacha. This matters. If you're in the middle of Baruch Sheamar, or in the middle of Yishtabach, and they're saying Kedusha, or they're saying Kaddish, are you supposed to answer? You're not supposed to answer. So the halacha is that Psukei de Zimra is a lower level than Birchas Kishma. You can answer more. But the brachas of Psukei de Zimra are the same as Birchas Kishma. So if you're in the first half of Baruch Sheamar and they're saying Kaddish, answer the first 5 amens. If you're in the second half of Baruch Sheamar, you only answer Amen Yesh Merabah and the last one. And the same is true in Yishtabach. If you're in the first half of Yishtabach before the bracha and they're saying Kaddish, you answer all 5 amens. It's Kaddish Merabah. Amen. We don't answer, right? You answer all 5 amens. If you're holding in the second half of Baruch Sheamar, from where it says Baruch Hashem Ken Lochelam, then you only answer Amen Yesh Merabah and the 5th amen Imru Amen. You see what I'm saying? And the same is true in Kedusha. If you're holding in the first half of Baruch Sheamar and they're saying Nagdishach, you say all the words. If you're in the second half, you don't say Nagdishach. You just say Kadosh Baruch and Yimlech. That's the halach. If you're holding in the first half, I'm not teaching these halachas now. If you want to know these halachas, on the back page of many of the Babbage and Durim, you have a map. It tells you how to read these. Where you should say what. So the second half of Baruch Sheamar is a bracha. The first half of Baruch Sheamar is holy words, but it's not yet a bracha. Some people hold that when it says that Baruch Sheamar is a note that came from heaven, it only means the first half, not the second half. The bracha, the Ajkan Sagdela wrote. But the Baruch Sheamar v'haya eila Baruch Hu Baruch Eim v'Ezer Baruch Yisrael Kai Baruch Yisrael V'Ezer Baruch Menachem Alaz Menachem Bis Baruch Meshalom Zachar Tei Baruch Adonai Netzach Baruch Peit Moshmei. All of those words, that's what came from heaven. Okay, so it's interesting, right? This detail, there's what to discuss. And there's one more fascinating thing, and this really blows my mind. If the Siddur is 2,500 years old, which it is, the oldest versions of Siddur we have is half that age. The oldest extant text of Siddur is that of Reb Namram Gon. And the Rambam Gon is on your second page, on the back of the first page, the third one. This is the first, this is the second, this is the third, this is the fourth. This is the Rambam Gon. The Rambam Gon is before Asad. He's the first person to compile a complete Siddur, not just with halachas, but also with text, with nusach. The oldest nusach that we have is the Rambam Gon, which is very interesting, okay? Now, Rasag, and I'm assuming Rosh Gon were after the Rambam Gon, teach us something mind-blowing. Mamish, mind-blowing. You know what that is? Once upon a time, and once upon a time means more than 1,000 years ago, on the weekday, you only said the second half of Baruch Sheamar, the bracha. Only Shabbos and Yom Tov did you say the first half. That custom is long gone. Everybody, Sfardim, Ashkenazim, Chassidim, Misnagdim, Yemenites and Italians, okay, those are the Nusachs. No, the Nusachs, there's really 4. Sfardim, Ashkenazim, Taimon, and Italian. Those are the 4 big Nusachs today, distinctive Nusachs. The Italians have a very distinct Nusach, the Yemenites have a distinct Nusach. Sfardim, what they call Edut HaMizrach, they call themselves in Eastern communities. It's not necessarily Sfardim. You Persian Jews are not Sfardim, they're Edut HaMizrach. They're Eastern Jews. They have what we would call a Nusach Sfard. And then Ashkenazim have the big split of Chassidim and Misnagdim, so it's 4 becomes 5 kind of, yeah. But the changes that the Chassidim make, for the most part, actually are towards the derech of the Sfard. We're going back to the Sfard because that's al pi Kabbalah, and we hold halacha b'Kabbalah, halacha k'Kabbalah. When there's an argument to Kabbalah halacha, you should change and it should be like the Kabbalah. Anyway, so a long time ago. In other words, before there were written Siddurim that reached us, people during the week only said the bracha by Baruch Sheamar. And although I didn't look, I would venture to say the same is true by Yishtabach. On Shabbos and on Yom Tov, they said the prefix. It was like special, you added it.
You said it was the same thing, the first half of Yishtabach, it was like a note fell from heaven?
No, I didn't see that. I didn't see that. I never researched Yishtabach. Baruch Sheamar, I actually once taught Baruch Sheamar someplace else. I have a lot of notes from an earlier session. So there's even an idea that Baruch Sheamar is divided into 2 parts, said on different occasions. During the week, you would have started in our Nusach on line 10. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam. Shabbos, they added the whole prefix, as you see in this one. See, you see the very top of the page? See the top of the page? This is not the oldest siddur. The oldest one is the third one, Rabbi Amram Gon. Rabbi Amram Gon, who was before the Rasag, doesn't make the distinction they make. Rabbi Amram Gon was before the Rasag, he was before the Pesach Gon, and he holds that you said the whole of Baruch Sheamar every day, not just Shabbos and Yom Tov. And of course, why would an earlier rabbi say things that we do, and a later rabbi say things we should no longer do? It has to do with where they lived. You understand? Rabbi Sadi Gon apparently lived in a place where they still had older traditions. Rabbi Amram Gon, either he himself already made the enactment that you should say the whole Baruch Sheamar every day, not just on Shabbos. The Siddur, you have to understand, you're talking about books that were written 500 years before printing, 500 years before the printing press, 400 in the printing press. So they're manuscripts found in libraries, places like British Museum, Cambridge, the Vatican, all the old museums that are holding ancient manuscripts that are very sacred to us. You understand? And a lot of them are incomplete. There's partial manuscripts. So there is a big book called Siddur HaRasag. It starts in the middle. We're missing the first bunch of pages. And part of what we're missing is the weekday davening. So if you look at the top of the page, that first paragraph is the Shabbos edition. That's why I wanted you to correct. You see where it says weekday, you crossed out weekday and you wrote Shabbos?
Yes.
Now you understand why. We're missing the next one, of Nosson. You see the Shabbos and the weekday side by side. If the Tzaddik Gaon's manuscript was complete, we would have by the Rasag also the Shabbos and the weekday versions side by side. We're missing the beginning of his Siddur. It's just how it works out. We call it Hakil Talib Mazla, Phil Sefer Teda Shebeichel. Everything is up to Mazel, even the Sefer Teda, which is in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, everything is Mazel. But understand this. If you're looking at the second, on page 2, the second Baruch Sheamar, on the left side it says Shabbos, on the right side it says weekday. You see that? Yes? On Shabbos they said the weekday also. They just said both. On Shabbos you would first read this and then read this. During the week you would only say this. Because if you look at your text, you look here, it says, Ad Seif HaBracha K'fi Shechafti Shesidarti L'maylo. The Shlomo Nissen Gaon writes, finished Baruch Sheamar that I wrote during the weekday davening. He doesn't bother writing it a second time. You understand? This is part of his Shabbos davening. This is weekday davening. So when he writes the Baruch Sheamar for Shabbos, he said, the rest of it you can take from the weekday. The problem is there's differences between how it's written here and it's written here, which is enough to drive you insane. Okay, so that's fantastic. That Baruch Sheamar is divided into two parts. One is a bracha and one is a prayer. And the cloud, halachically, brachas are the highest thing. Nothing is higher than a bracha. I mean, the Gemara speaks about brachas, and the halacha speaks about brachas with an extraordinary earnestness. If you're not sure, you're not allowed to make a bracha. You're not allowed to make a bracha. You girls are learning in Machon Chana. I'm assuming you learn halacha. Is that correct?
Yes.
Have you heard the expression "safek brachas lahakil"?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
No.
If you're not sure if you made a bracha or if you have to make it, don't make it. You know what the truth is? It's actually safek brachas lahachmid. We call it safek brachas lahakil. If you're not sure if you made a bracha, don't make it. But you know why you don't make it? Because we're very machmid about saying a bracha in vain. You understand? Safek brachas lahakil is real safek brachas lahachmid. Now, if you say Hashem's name, it's not good. But Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam, which is the nusach of a bracha, which is called Shem Malchus. Saying that in vain is like almost like a shvuah. It's much worse than saying Hashem's name in vain. Brachas we're very particular about. Our siddur grows and grows and grows and grows. You know that. The siddur grows and grows and grows and grows and grows. But we never make up new brachas. Never. There are people who hold that the only brachas we have are the ones made by the Anshe Kesach Gedolah, the original composite of the siddur. And they got some weird brachas which we never say ever. For those of us who learned Shlosh Brachim and Rambam a few days ago, everything in Rambam is a few days ago, we learned the siddur of the Rambam and the Hilchos Tefillah of the Rambam, and you see many, many brachas which we never say. But we never make up new brachas. Never make up new brachas. There's a bracha which is a noisein la yo'ev keich. And again, if you daven in non-Chabad communities and in non-Chabad shuls, you may have seen this. In our morning brachas, there's one bracha that's from the Go'onim. That means from 1,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago, something like that. Hanoisei la yo'ev keich. When people became weaker, they added a bracha. Hashem should go after the weak. And there are people who don't say it. I think Nusach Ashkenaz, you don't say Nesnev Koyach. Why? Because when it comes to bracha, if it doesn't go back, we don't add brachas. We do, the prayers grow and grow and grow and grow. The middles of the brachas can grow. But the essential nusach of the bracha, which is Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, that's what makes it a bracha. And of course, there's a short bracha, which is Baruch Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, Shakal Ne'evet Dvari, for example. There's a long bracha, like Baruch Atah Hashem Asher Yotzer Adon B'Chochmah. The finish is Baruch Atah Hashem. It says twice Baruch Atah Hashem. Reifik L'Basar Mafli L'Aseis. And then you have brachas that don't start with Baruch but finish with Baruch, like Elakaim Neshavish L'Sat Navi, Baruch Atah Hashem, Hamachas Neshameis of God Amazing. So there's different kinds of brachas, and the rules of brachas are the most ancient, constant in our liturgy. There's 19 brachas of Shmoneh. You don't change them. Now the middles change, but the basic design of those 19 brachas, there isn't a Jew in the world doesn't say the same 19 brachas in the same order. Chassidim, Misnagdim, Svardim, Italians, and Yemenites, and every other variation, the brachas are never changing. When you have a longer bracha with words in the middle can be played around with, but you don't touch brachas. You don't make new brachas at all. There's no new brachas. It's very serious. So Baruch Sheamar has two parts. The second half is the bracha. Yishabach has two parts. The second half is the bracha. So from the perspective of halacha, that's more important than the first part. The first part is just, forgive me for saying that word, it's the schmaltz, it's the part that makes it interesting, the part that makes you cry, that makes you warm, makes you feel close to the Eibishter. You understand? But it's possible that in Kabbalah it's the other way around. In halacha, there's nothing, in davening, in liturgy, there's nothing more important than a bracha. Nothing. Ever. And we don't mess around with brachas. A new bracha has not been added to our liturgy at least for 1,000 years. Not new tefillas, new brachas. And a bracha means Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam. You don't make brachas. Nobody does. They go back to the times of the Mishnah and to the Gemara and before, to the Zman of the Anshe Knes Haggadah. It's one of those details. But the brachas, prayers can be enhanced all the time, but brachas we don't mess with. Which is why, if you look at the Siddur, some people are biggest Siddurim, some people are shortest Siddurim, but the brachas are all starting at the same. It's just a constant. It doesn't change. 1 second. So now when it comes to Baruch Sheamar, if Baruch Sheamar has two parts, as I'm showing you, and that in fact there was once a custom to say only part of Baruch Sheamar every day, and only on Shabbos and on Yom Tov to say the long nusach of Baruch Sheamar. And the more important part is the second part. The more important part is the Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam v'aracham anahu b'famei. Shu b'cham b'fei b'shei chasidav avodav. And at the same time we say that it's the first half of Baruch Sheamar that came from heaven as a note. So here you see a very interesting idea. Halacha says brachas, 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 brachas. Don't confuse me with fancy stuff. And Kabbalah says there are things that are higher than bracha. The things that are higher than bracha have been changed. The brachas never change. In other words, even the Mukubalim, who are going to say that the first half of Baruch Sheamar, which is the Piskei Mishmei Nachsan, according to those who say that only the first half of Baruch Sheamar came from heaven, and the second half of Baruch Sheamar was written by whomever, and possibly by the Ashkenaz Gedolim. Possibly. But the first half was written by whomever, but it came from notes from heaven. Halachically, it's not important at all. Kabbalistically, it's more important than the bracha. But whether it's more important or less important, our liturgy, our siddhs changed over time. Not the brachas. You understand? The brachas remain the same. So even if mystically speaking, the bracha is lower, the first half Baruch Sheamar, halachically speaking, the brachas are unchangeable, and Kabbalah doesn't touch that. Kabbalah doesn't mess around with brachas. It may be saying higher things, but brachas you don't touch. And there's ways of explaining how you can change something higher, but you can't change something lower. There's ways of explaining it mystically, but that's the way the siddur is structured and designed. I'll let you speak in a minute. I want to say one more thing, okay? I want to say one more thing, which is just, it's good to hear, because this is really the first time since Birchas HaShachar, in 10 years, that we're learning a tefillah which is so old, that you have, look how many pages I have. You have 4 sheets. You see, you open up page 2, you have 4 Baruch Sheamar. Page 3, you have 3 more Baruch Sheamars, and page 4, you have 3 more. And I actually left out a couple. It's a bunch of different texts about the words. Now, some of these texts are repetitious. They're not all that novel, but just look at the bottom of page 2. This is the Machzaviti. The Machzaviti is a Talmud of Rashi, which would lead me to think that this is the Daven Nusah, the Rashi Daven Nusah. He himself has 2 texts side by side. You see, and a lot of teeny tiny words in there. So there's a lot. It's the first time we're coming across a paragraph of Philo, which is, as they say in the culture, confusing. When we get to Mizmor Soida, means that the capital Tilm. Everyone says it exactly the same. When you get to Ashrei, it's a capital Tilm. Everyone says it exactly the same. When you get to the Brachas, which no one's ever allowed to change, they have all the changes. Okay, so I just want to say one more thing, and then I'll let you speak in whatever order. And that is the following. Appreciate that the Siddur is probably 600 years older than the Mishnah. From the Mishnah. It's probably 900 years older than the Gemara. The Siddur was made by the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, who saw the first Beis Hamikdash. Mordechai was the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. Mordechai in the Megillah was the member of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. Okay? Before the second Beis Hamikdash, and before and during the very, very beginning, they compiled the Siddur to the beginning of the Beis Hamikdash. Between the first Beis Hamikdash and the very, very beginning. Okay, but here's the deal: just like there was a halacha that prevented people from writing down the Torah Shabbat Peh, you know this, right? I hope you know this.
Yeah.
It's a passage it's a Rashi based on a Gemara. That you're allowed to write down Ksei v'sadvorim ha'ela. Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, write down these words. Ki api advorim ha'ela krati itcha bris v'es Yisrael. With these words, I'm making a covenant with the Jewish people. So the Gemara says, and Rashi brings it, as advorim ha'ela ksei. These words you can write. And dvorim shavapeh yate Rashi l'kesem. The oral Torah is not allowed to be written down. It's not allowed to be written down. So we have the Tanakh, the scripture, which we know is 24 Svarim, 24 books. But what we now would call Halachic Judaism, Torah Shabbat Peh, which begins with the Mishnah and the Gemara and the Braisis and the Savaroi and the Rishonim, all of that was oral for a very long time, for close to 1,500 years or more. It was Baal Peh. Yidden were learning it and studying it, and they were not writing it down. Now, just to throw in I don't know what the right word is, a tidbit, a titillation. My mother's father, his name was Abishal Cheskelstein. He was my Zaidi, so for me he was a very, very special man. He was actually a very special man. For me, he could do no wrong. He was my grandfather. He was my young and cool grandfather. I had an old and sage. My father's father. When I was born, he was 65. My mother's father, when I was born, he wasn't even 50. Right, I wasn't even 50. So my grandfather was the young Zaidi. He played baseball with me, you understand? It was a very Elecha Yid. He was American born. My mother's father was American born. My grandfather's grandfather was in the United States of America in the 1880s. He actually was Zoychat learning in yeshiva. He looked at Teredas. Many Jewish boys and girls didn't have yeshivas at all. But his Rebbe, his Yiddishkeit, was a Jew by the name of Rabbi Mendelovitz, Rabbi Mendelovitz, who made the yeshiva Teredas. He didn't call him, he had called Mr. Mendelovitz. His name was Mr. It was his shtick, Mr. Mendelovitz. My grandfather did not have a lot of pictures of the Dalim in his house. He had a picture of Mr. Mendelovitz. That's it. He was his Rebbe, his everything. And Mr. Mendelovitz was a Chassidic shed, actually. He was a very interesting man. He was a great educator. He was a pedagogue. He had technique. He understood education.
Was he Lubavitch?
No, not at all. He was Galician. But he would bang with the boys. He would sing the Gunim with them. There was a warmth in Terevidas. It used to be a Chassidic yeshiva. It's now, the Terevidas split in half. There's a Chassidic Terevidas and literally the Chassidic Terevidas moved to Muncie. And they're called Beis Medrash Elliot. Terevidas in Brooklyn is an Ashkenaz yeshiva. But it used to be a Chassidic yeshiva. So Mr. Mendelovitz had a great influence on my grandfather. And my grandfather would quote him all the time. And one of the things he said was that the whole world has the Bible. The whole world has the Bible. But not the whole world has the Shulchan Aruch. Why do you think that is? Because it was oral. If the law, if the mitzvahs had been written down, when the Chodesh Shabbos had written down, the whole world would be keeping Shabbos. And you wouldn't know it was a goy. Shabbos morning, we say a prayer. In Shmoneh Esrei, Hashem did not give Shabbos to goy. Hashem did not give Shabbos to goy. We say it every Shabbos. And it's weird. How many times is Shabbos mentioned in the Chumash? How many times? I think 50 or 49. An enormous number of times. Over and over again. Keep Shabbos, keep Shabbos, keep Shabbos, keep. If you collect all the biblical references to Shabbos, you don't have a clue how to keep it. Because the Lamed Tes Malachas of Shabbos are all about Peh. The 39 prohibitions, what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do, is all oral. And it first appears in the Mishnah and the Gemara. It's not in the Chumash. So a guy can say, okay, I'm going to keep the Sabbath. He doesn't have a clue to keep the Sabbath because the details of keeping the Sabbath are not in the scripture. They're in our oral tradition. Because the Eibishter wanted the Goyim to have Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Neach, the 7 mitzvahs that he gave them, which of course the Rebbe points out is actually many more than 7 mitzvahs. And he didn't have 613 mitzvahs. And this was his trick. He gave us the Chodesh Shabbos and said, listen, to understand this book, you have to have a parallel oral tradition. Don't write it down. Don't write it down. And they delayed it to about 1,500 years. But at the time Rabbi HaKadosh wrote it, Christianity already existed. Christianity predates the writing of the Mishnah. So Christianity came from Judaism, but it's biblical Judaism. It's mystical Judaism. It's prophet-based Judaism. It's not halachic-based Judaism. Which is why Christianity has that feature, which is discussed in the Daily Yisrael, called bittul mitzvahs. The Christians say you don't have to keep the mitzvahs anymore. Because the Christian version of Judaism was based on the idea of prophecy and scripture, not halacha. Even though in the time of the second Beis Hamikdash, this was the big fight. The big war amongst Jews in the time of the second Beis Hamikdash was how important is halachic Judaism, how binding is halachic Judaism. If a rabbi gave a psak for an earlier generation, do I have to keep it? We hold yes. And they held it, how will you feel? You understand? So by the time the Mishnah was written down, Christianity already was. And then Islam came along instead of Islam. They said Christianity is a mixture of paganism and Judaism, and Islam is a mixture of Christianity and Judaism. So they have more mitzvahs. They have some kind of a concept of kosher. The Muslims have more mitzvahs that they took from us. But the Eibishter wanted mitzvahs to be Jewish. This was his trick. The Chodesh was not recorded till the 2nd century, till 1,800 years ago, let's say, and something like that. Now, the point of this whole lecture is to say this. The Siddur wasn't written down either. For those 600 years, from the time of the Antichrist secondary, when Siddur was written, until the 2nd century, when Rabbi HaKadosh wrote the Mishnah, Yidden were davening by heart. You understand? They were davening by heart. The entire Siddur, and again, as I pointed out, one of the key components of the Siddur is the brachas. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, al natil yadayim, asher kedishanu b'tzitzah v'tzivanu, al natil yadayim. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu asher yatzar es ha'adam b'chochma, u'varevei nekavim b'chalulim chalulim, Baruch Hashem, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam. There's different orders. Haneisen lasech v'vin lahafchen bein yem v'vein lara, paikech ivrim, mater asurim, zekev kufim, mal b'shalomim. And then we add Haneisen lo yoav kech, which was written much later, and some Jews don't even say it. Reik orsal lamoyim. These brachas are as old as the Siddur. They're 2,500 years old. But people said them by heart. They were not allowed to write them down. Which resulted in the following phenomenon. The average Jew could not daven. Because if you don't know the Nusach by heart, you can't pray. It wasn't written. This is why by davening, the Shliach Tzibur became so important. The Chazan, who leads the davening, became so critical. Because what qualified a Chazan to be a Chazan is that he knew the Nusach by heart. And people came to shul, and the Chazan would say, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, and they wouldn't say Baruch Hu Baruch Shmei. Haneis nasach v'vinu lahafchen b'yem, and he answered, Amen, and you and Yoitze Oina, God lo Oina, Amen, Yesem, and Amavarach, Shemei HaKa'oina, when you listen to the bracha and you say Amen on the bracha, it's as if you said the bracha yourself.
Why did that change?
Because the Siddur was written down, that's why it changed.
Why couldn't they write that down? Because they weren't allowed to?
For the same reason, you are not allowed to write down anything else. The Siddur is part of Teresh Sheba'al Peh. And Teresh Sheba'al Peh is not allowed to be written. Only Teresh Sheba'al Peh is allowed to be written. So the oldest Siddur we have, let's say, is 1,200 years old, which is approximately a little bit less than half the age of the Siddur per se. But in the first 1,200 years, half of those years, there was no written Siddur at all. You see what I'm saying? From the time Chodesh to the time that the Mishnah was written, the Siddur was all oral. Now, they may find in some museum, they may find in the Vatican a text of Siddur which predates the Bamram Gun, who knows? But we do not have the oldest versions of Siddur. A, they were never written. B, from the time they were written, remember, there was no printing press. Everything was copied by hand. They're lost over time. Now, it could be that the Amram Gaon's Nusach, for example, or Rabbi Saadia Gaon's Nusach, or Rosh Gaon's Nusach, or the Rambam's Nusach, or Machzavitni's Nusach, the Rishonim that we have, were copied from earlier texts, which can go back much before. But did the Rambam write his own Nusach, or did the Rambam copy from his father? And if the Rambam copied his father, who did his father copy? And who did his father? How far does each... We attribute the Nuschos that we have to the people who wrote them down officially. But they didn't necessarily write their own Nusach. They wrote the Nusach that they had from before. And how far back does that go? It's all part of the drama of understanding the evolution of the Siddur. And it explains the variations. It explains why there's such differences. Okay? Now you had questions. You're first and you're second.
I don't know if I remember mine. So
Works every time.
Sorry.
I didn't do that on purpose, but we're good.
Okay. So my question is, if the first half of Baruch Sheamar is higher, why are we allowed to interrupt it halachically, even though you said that you can change something higher but not lower? Yet Kabbalah respects the halachic status of brachos.
It never change.
Even though they weren't.
Right.
That's the question.
Well, technically the answer is, that's what halacha says.
Okay.
And in the end, we're Orthodox Jews. You know what Orthodox Jews means? We follow halacha.
Sure.
Now we Chassidim and Chal Mekubal, especially Chassidim, do a lot of things which are halachically questionable, seriously halachically questionable. And Misnagdim scream, "Excuse me, sir, it doesn't show halach kach v'kach." And there's answers. For every single case, there needs to be a distinct explanation. But we don't make these kinds of things up. The Rabbeim made these kinds of things up. We're very, very careful. But there are certain things that not only our Rabbeim didn't touch, the Arizal wouldn't touch. The Arizal was bold. He was so great. He was so much greater than everybody else. We have no fathoming how great the Arizal was. The Arizal is one of the greatest effectors of change in the whole tradition of the Jewish people, particularly the liturgy, the Nusach. He didn't mess with brachas. Now, maybe Kabbalah's higher than brachas, but you don't mess with brachas. You don't mess with brachas. Why? That's not halacha. Now, the mysticism that would support that would be, if Kabbalah goes above Ishtalshalos, it doesn't change Ishtalshalos. Ishtalshalos remains the same. So the Nusach HaTfilah, which is 25 or 30, which is with the parameters of Seder Ishtalshalos, that's constant. Now, using Kabbalah, Sayyid, and all kinds of other ideas, you can go higher. And higher things are more not fixed, they're more fluid. But the Ishtalshalos doesn't change. See what I'm saying? That's the answer. That's my insight. That's my thought. But we don't mess around with brachas. We do not mess around. It's fascinating to watch. All Jews have the same brachas. Like I said before, some of them we never say. But there's no new brachas. Brachas were made by the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, period. So the Rebbe brings the Shulchan Aruch that the Goyim made a bracha Neisel Layoyev Keah, which means 1,000 years, or close to 1,000 years after Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, and he writes, some people don't want to say it for this reason. You don't have brachas. Period. You just don't have brachas. But it's the only one. It's the only one. It's not the only one, because the fourth bracha, benching, has to do with the event that happened at the Churban Bayesheni. There are other brachas, but very, very few. But the Arizal didn't add brachas. The Baal Shem Tov didn't. The Chassidim didn't add brachas. Brachas you don't mess around with. Even if you hold that you can go higher than brachas, you don't touch brachas. Brachas are constant. They don't change.
Thank you, that makes sense.
Is that because it was Hashem put the Torah into our hands and that's what the sages like came up with?
The expression in the Gemara is matbeya shetovu chachamim bebrachas. Matbeya means the mint by which the rabbis minted the blessings. It's the very beginning of the Shas. The second or the third Mishnah in brachas is about don't mess around brachas. The first chapter of Tractate Brachas, which is about saying Shema at night and in the morning, and that along with Shema you say brachas, tells you right away, don't mess with brachas. It's not a Gemara. It's in the Mishnah. In the very, you can't read 4 lines of Shas without knowing this. You don't change brachas. So the expression is matbeya shetovu, the mint by which the Chachamim minted the brachas. Now, on the simple level, that means the Anshe Kesed Hagdol. But you have to understand something. The Anshe Kesed Hagdol didn't exist in a vacuum. When the Anshe Kesed Hagdol sat down to make the changes that they made, they sealed the Tanakh, they created a whole new approach to halachic Judaism, they made the Siddur, they made all kinds of other takonos. Anshe Kesed Hagdol, there are Reformation. The Reformation of Jewish history is the Anshe Kesed Hagdol. But they were building on what came before them. And we don't know what came before them because that was for sure oral. It's very reasonable to say that the brachas were not made by Anshe Kesed Hagdol. They were formulated by Anshe Kesed Hagdol, but there was Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam is older than Anshe Kesed Hagdol. I mean, there's a Gemara. Have you heard of a guy named David HaMelech? You ever heard of him? Yeah, heard of him? Yeah. Was he before or after Anshe Kesed Hagdol? Hundreds of years before. It was before the first Beis HaMikdash. Anshe Kesed Hagdol has been the first and second Beis HaMikdash. David was the one who enacted to say 100 brachas a day. So who made brachas? It probably goes back to Moshe Rabbeinu. You see, prayer in the olden days was using your own language. The Rambam writes that the only reason the Siddur had to be written is because one of the rules of davening is you have to speak only in one language and it has to be a pure language. Meaning, it's not allowed to have words from other language woven in. Now today, there's no such thing. Every language is a cholent. English is half German and half Latin and half, I don't know what else.
So it doesn't apply anymore?
So the halacha is, you have to daven in a pure language. So when Jews spoke pure Hebrew, they just wrote their own prayers. The Siddur was written because Jews forgot Hebrew.
It wasn't in the same.
And Hebrew began to become adulterated languages. And he mentions another thing also. People began to mispronounce certain letters and certain consonants and certain vowels. So they wrote a text so that the prayer should be according to the required halachic thread that you have to speak only in one language. So it's man by Sishbit wrote their own prayers. But it doesn't mean they wrote their own brachas. Meaning if you wrote a prayer for yourself because you wanted the flowers to come up this year a week early, or the pollen shouldn't bother you as much, yeah? So you took existing prayers and you modified it. So it's very reasonable to assume, I'm just telling, David HaMelech was Masak and Mea Brachas, he's way before him. Who wrote the Nusach of Hazon? It says Moshe Rabbeinu was Masak in the first Brach of Shmones. Yeshua ben Masak in the second, but I'm sorry, of benching. And David and Shlomo Masak in the third Brach of benching. Now this is tricky how that works, because they certainly did not have all the words we have, because in these prayers, they're mentioned by name. They talk about the building of the Beis HaMikdash before the Beis HaMikdash was built. But the design, the basic design of those brachas goes back a very, very long time. So this notion of Shem Malchus, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam, and the same is true for the word Asher Kedishonu b'mitzvah v'tzivanu. It's very reasonable to presume that although we attribute it to Anshe Kesed Hagdol, it goes back much earlier. But one thing is for sure, we don't mess around. We don't make up our own brachas. We do not make up our own brachas, period.
Right. I guess I'm thinking about like philosophically, like even though the Arizal could see into like above Hishtalshalos and see like the Kabbalah that comes above, like whatever we came up with down here, like that has to stay.
Well, it's, if you go back far enough in our history, you're talking about people whose halacha was so one with Kabbalah, we have no understanding what it means. Who taught Arizal Kabbalah? Eliyahu Hanavi. That means Eliyahu Hanavi was as smart as Arizal. He lived 600 years into the Jewish family, right? So there were Yidden around once upon a time who knew as much Kabbalah as Arizal. They just didn't tell it to us. And we're very respectful of those ancient forms and our ignorance and understanding them because we know that they knew more than we do. You understand? Anyway, we're wasting time here. We're beating around the bush. For me, this is great. Why? Because to prepare Baruch Sheamar is going to take a year. So if I can waste the year to start teaching, it'll be about it. So what I wanted to do today, and I really don't have much time, is I should read it. But I'm not going to read it. I'll read it next week. We have 10 minutes, okay? I'm giving you an assignment to do in class. Open up the second page and look at the differences between one text and another. You know, I'll tell you what we'll do. How many are we here? We are 8 people, yeah? We're 8 people? Oh, we're 8 people? Okay. Who wants to read our text? Someone volunteer. So you keep your book closed. You're reading Baruch Sheamar, first page, okay? You read a line and you stop. Where I made the vertical line, you stop. Now, going in counterclockwise this way, you're going to read Rasag. I'm going to read Rabbi Shlomo ben Rab Nassim Gon. You're going to read Rab Amram Gon. You're going to read the first Machzavitri, which means this. You're going to read the second Machzavitri, which means this. What's your name?
Me?
Yeah. You're going to read the Rambam version, which is the top of this page. Okay? And your name is? Huh? Beth. You'll read the Chidah at the bottom. Okay?
I can't read Hebrew that well.
Oh, fine. So I'll do double dips, okay? You read a line, and then you read it, and then I'll read it, and see how different it is. It'll make you crazy. It's just an exercise. This is just interesting. Go ahead.
Baruch Sheamar v'ha'elam Baruch Hu. Baruch Sheamar v'ha'elam Baruch Hu.
Baruch Sheamar v'ha'elam Baruch Hu. Your turn.
You know.
This one.
It's in like where should say this is. Oh, you got me.
But I'm so sorry, I'm not allowed to read it without this.
Okay, so you read.
Baruch Sheamar v'ha'elam Baruch Hu. And the other one is Baruch Sheamar v'ha'elam Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo.
Baruch Sheamar. Now, could you read without Nekudas?
Yeah, I don't know where you are.
You're reading here on the left side, on the bottom of page 2.
Baruch Sheamar. Wait, let me.
Yeah.
I can't pick the word.
Baruch Hu, Baruch Shemai. So we have the first big difference, that in several Nuschos, after the first line, it says 2 expressions, Baruch Hu and Baruch Shemai. Now, Ariella, what did I tell you to do? You do Rambam, okay, which has Nekudas. Go ahead.
Baruch Sheamar v'ha'elam Baruch Hu.
The Baruch Shemai is gone, right? Now, I'll read the Chidah, which is the Nusach Sfat, which is really our Nusach. Baruch Sheamar v'ha'elam Baruch Hu. Okay, now your turn. Read the second line.
Baruch Sheamar v'ha'elam. Baruch Sheamar v'ha'elam.
Okay, I'm also Baruch Sheamar v'ha'elam. Rabbi Amram gone?
Baruch Oseh.
No, Baruch Sheamar v'ha'elam.
Baruch Sheamar v'ha'elam, and also the other one, Baruch Oseh Maaseh Bereshit.
So wait. Look at Oseh Maaseh Bereshit comes after that.
And Baruch Sheamar v'ha'elam.
They switch around the order. You see, they have both, but they switch around the order. Correct? And the same is true in the second one, Baruch Eiseh Maaseh Bereshit, and then Baruch Sheamar v'ha'elam. So a few Nuschos put Sheamar v'ha'elam after Baruch Eiseh Maaseh Bereshit. Okay, now you read the Rambam? You want to read the Rambam to us?
Baruch Sheamar v'ha'elam.
Okay. Now you read, and I'll read the Chidah at the bottom. Baruch Sheamar v'ha'elam. Okay, now go back to the first page, read the next line.
Baruch Sheamar v'ha'elam.
Okay.
Baruch Sheamar.
Baruch Gezerim Kaim.
Baruch Gezerim Kayem, and also the Vitar, the Baruch Gezerim Kayem.
Okay. They're both Baruch Gezerim Kaim. Okay, now you're reading the Rambam. Go ahead.
Baruch Sheamar.
Okay. Next.
Baruch Eiseh Bereshit.
Baruch Marachim.
It's missing.
Yeah.
Missing. Baruch Eis. Baruch. What were those words? Baruch Gezer Makayim is missing, right? Now, in the Noson's gone, wait a minute. Wait a second. Which words did you just say?
First, Baruch, let's say gracious, right? No. Let's say gracious.
Use the Baruch Ezer Bereshis. So in the Amram gone, in the Sag Baruch Ezer Bereshis is missing. In the Noson gone, it's also missing. In the Amram gone, it's there after Baruch Ezer Makayim, Baruch Ezer Bereshis. So now you do the Amram gone the Machzavetri.
Baruch עושה בראשית. Also.
Okay, what about in the Machzavetri?
Also Baruch עושה בראשית.
Baruch Hosei Ma'aseh Bereshis, and it's before Oime V'Eiseh and Gezer Makayim, right? Now you read the Rambam. No, we're holding Baruch Gezer Makayim, correct?
Yeah.
Baruch Gezer Makayim. Oh, so you don't have it.
Yeah.
She's also missing Baruch Eiseh Ma'aseh Bereshis. Okay, now you go next. Back to page 1. This is not working out so good, but okay.
Baruch Rachim also.
Okay.
Yeah, oh no, Baruch Rachim also Habrius.
You're missing Baruch
Yeah.
Baracham Aladas. And what do I have? I have also Baruch Baracham Aladas. I don't have Baracham Aladas. Reb Amram Gon has both, correct? Baruch Baracham Aladas, Baruch Baracham Aladas. What about the Machzavetri?
We doesn't have also, and he say both
He does have both. What about the Rambam? He does have both. Baruch Baracham Aladas, Baruch, yeah, both. Baruch Baracham. Okay, now next.
Baruch Hashem, Shachar Tereya.
Okay, so we'll skip. Baruch Hashem Zachatei L'Reyev. Now what do you got?
Down on that.
You don't have it at all. You do. On the third line. He jumps around. Baruch Hashem Zachatei L'Reyev. You see?
Yeah.
I have it right after Menachem Abrius, Baruch Hashem Zachatei L'Reyev. And Reb Amram Gon has it also after Menachem Abrius, Baruch Hashem Zachatei L'Reyev. What about the Machzavetri? Very good. And in the other version? Baruch Hashem Zachatei L'Reyev, U'lekoivav, U'lechoisei boy. Wow. Now the Rambam, and then it says Baruch Misham Zachatei L'Reyev, right? So he has it all. He has it in the wrong or different order. Anyway, you get the message. If you were to line up all the different Baruch She'amars and to make sense out of each and every one of them, make them all work. As they say in philosophy, each one should be consistent to itself. You got it in mind. You can spend your whole life learning this. Because it's talking about siddur. Every word matters, especially in the second half, which is a bracha. And you're talking about the go'onim and the rishonim. Look at the variation. It's a taste. It's a window into what's going on. I would encourage you, if you have a little time, to spend some time looking at this. And what you could do is take the numbers that I wrote over here on the first page and apply them to each one and see what you come up with.
It doesn't make sense. If this fell from a note from heaven, why is it going?
Because that note wasn't written down for 600 years.
All right.
Now, if it's a note from heaven, how do you mess around with a divine message? So there's answers to that too. There's answers to that also. I have an opinion about notes coming from heaven. I don't think it necessarily means literally a paper, an inspiration. I'll talk about it later, Mr. Shem. Okay, we had a class. I will see you in a week.
Is the Rambam also follows Faradim, right?
In the times of the Rambam came from Spain. So in the times of the Rambam, I don't think you could have used the expression Eidut HaMizrach just yet.
No, but like for example, Moroccan and Eidut HaMizrach has different nusach. It's the same thing, but Moroccan has a lot more, like the Shem Yichud, and they have much more Kabbalah than the Mizrach.
Right, and that comes probably from the Chidah, who lived in Eretz Yisrael. But the prayers are the same. The tefillot are the same. But the Rambam is before, I think the Rambam is before that. Earlier, it's hard to know. Okay, that was interesting, yes?
Very.
So you mentioned, like parenthetically, about like the Shem Mrs. Minah having like a lot more mitzvahs.
Of course.
Like, I don't know what my question is, but like, how do, like, we learn what those mitzvahs are that correspond to?
They're written in books.